Have you ever been told your entire life that you're not enough? That you're the consolation prize in the genetic lottery? My grandfather, Jonathan Callahan, was a man who built an empire from scratch, and he saw the world in terms of predators and prey, sharks and sheep. And in his eyes, I was a sheep. My older brother, Nolan, he was the shark. At least, that's what everyone thought. But my grandfather, in his final brilliant act, taught us all a lesson about what it truly means to be a predator. And the thing about predators is, the most dangerous ones are the ones you never see coming. The ones who have the patience to wait for the perfect moment to strike. This is the story of how a single tarnished silver coin made me the richest man in my family, and how my brother's greed cost him everything. It's a long story, but trust me, the ending is worth it. So stick with me, and I'll tell you exactly how it all went down. My grandfather wasn't just a shrewd investor, he was a titan, a force of nature carved from granite and ambition. He'd started Callahan Industries with a single truck and a loan he'd practically wrestled from the bank. By the time he was 50, he was a legend. By the time he was 80, he was a myth. His presence filled every room he entered, sucking the air out and replacing it with an atmosphere of pure, unadulterated power. He had this way of looking at you, with eyes the color of a stormy sea, that made you feel like he was conducting a full forensic audit of your soul, and he didn't like the numbers he was seeing. For my brother Nolan, this look was a challenge, a gauntlet thrown down that he was always eager to snatch up. For me, it was a confirmation of what I'd always felt in his presence, that I was a disappointment. Nolan was the heir apparent. He was born for the role, charismatic, handsome, with a charming smile that could disarm a hostile board of directors, and a ruthless streak that our grandfather called killer instinct. He was the sun in our family's solar system, and everyone else, myself included, were just little planets caught in his orbit. I was Maxwell, the quiet one, the thoughtful one. In the Callahan dynasty, those were just polite words for weak. While Nolan was out making high-risk, high-reward trades with his trust fund allowance, I was in the old workshop on the family estate, learning how to restore antique furniture. While Nolan was flying to Monaco for the Grand Prix, I was reading about economic history. My grandfather saw Nolan's flash and his swagger as signs of a worthy successor. He saw my quiet pursuits as proof that I was, as he once told his lawyer in a voice I was not meant to hear, lacking the constitution for true power. Those words, overheard through a slightly ajar study door, became the brand on my soul. They didn't just hurt, they defined me. From that moment on, I stopped trying to win his approval. I understood it was a game I was never meant to win. So I retreated further into my own world, a world he saw as pointless. I found a strange kind of peace there, away from the constant pressure and judgment of the Callahan name. When grandfather passed away at the age of 92, it felt less like a death and more like a change in the global climate. The center of our universe had vanished. A week later, Nolan and I were summoned to the downtown offices of Finch Covington and Crowe, the law firm that had handled the Callahan family's affairs for over 60 years. Mr. Alistair Finch was almost as much of an institution as my grandfather. He was a tall, skeletal man with a face that seemed to be made of parchment paper, and he'd been my grandfather's closest confidant. He greeted us with a somber nod, his expression unreadable. He sat us down in his cavernous office, the walls lined with leather-bound books that smelled of dust and money. "Your grandfather was a man of particular methods," Mr. Finch began, his voice a dry rustle. "His will is a complex document, and the bulk of it will be read in 6 months' time, in accordance with his instructions. However, he left something for each of you to tide you over. A preliminary bequest." He slid 2 small, ornate brass keys across the vast mahogany desk. They were identical. "These are keys to 2 safe deposit boxes at the National Commerce Bank. Box 713 is for you, Nolan. Box 714 is for you, Maxwell." Nolan snatched his key up, a hungry glint in his eye. "A preliminary bequest. What are we talking here, Alistair?" "A few of the old man's watches." Mr. Finch's expression didn't flicker. "Your grandfather was not a man who dealt in trinkets." That was all the encouragement Nolan needed. We went straight to the bank. The vault was a cathedral of silence and steel. Nolan was practically vibrating with anticipation. He strode up to his box, inserted the key with a flourish, and pulled out a long metal container. He opened it, and a low whistle escaped his lips. I leaned over his shoulder and saw them neat stacks of bearer bonds, crisp and official. Well, well, well. Nolan grinned, his voice echoing slightly in the vault. He held one up to the light. Bearer bonds. The old man was old school, untraceable, anonymous. He quickly counted a stack. Looks like $1 million. A cool million. He laughed, a loud, booming sound that felt like a sacrilege in that quiet place. He looked over at me, his smile dripping with condescending pity. Good luck, little brother. Hope you get something better than a pocket watch. He slammed his box shut, gathered up the bonds, and practically swaggered out of the vault, already talking on his phone to a broker, his voice full of plans for fast cars and faster women. I was left standing there, my own key feeling heavy and cold in my hand. I walked to box 714, my heart a leaden weight in my chest. I knew it was pointless. He'd left Nolan $1 million. What could he possibly have left for me, the family disappointment? I opened the box. It was almost empty. There was no stack of bonds, no envelopes of cash, no deeds to property. There was just a single small object resting on a bed of black velvet. It was a silver coin, so tarnished and dark with age that it looked like a lump of lead. Beside it lay a small cream-colored card, folded in half. I picked it up. My grandfather's sharp, aggressive handwriting filled the inside. It didn't say "I love you" or "I'm proud of you." It said only this: the value of a thing is not what it is, but what it becomes. Patience is the currency of kings. I stood there for a long time, in the cold, silent vault, staring at the useless coin and the cryptic note. $1 million for Nolan, the shark, a tarnished coin for me, the sheep. It wasn't just a slight, it was a final posthumous slap in the face. A perfectly crafted message from beyond the grave, confirming everything I'd ever feared he thought about me. I was worthless. And in that moment, the hurt was so profound, so sharp, it felt like a physical blow. I slid the coin and the note into my pocket, the faint metallic smell of it clinging to my fingers, and walked out of that bank, feeling like the poorest man on earth. The weeks that followed the visit to the bank were some of the darkest of my life. The hurt wasn't a clean wound, it was a festering infection that poisoned every thought. My grandfather's final act had been to erect a monument to my inadequacy, and he'd given my brother the megaphone to announce it to the world. And Nolan, true to form, did not disappoint. He cashed the bonds immediately, and the money hit his account like a lit match in a fireworks factory. His spending spree was not just extravagant, it was biblical. It started with a cherry-red Ferrari, which he made sure to drive by my quiet apartment building, revving the engine until my windows rattled. Then came the parties, lavish affairs at a newly leased penthouse that became the stuff of tabloid legend. He was photographed with models, actors, and various hangers-on, always with a bottle of champagne in one hand, and a condescending quote for the press about how he was living the life his grandfather would have wanted. Every time I saw his face splashed across a gossip site, or heard his name dropped in a hushed, envious tone by someone at a cafe, it was like a fresh twist of the knife. He started calling me, his voice slick with faux concern. "Hey Max, just checking in. How's whatever it is you do, still got that old coin? You could probably get a good $20 for it at a pawn shop, might buy you a nice dinner." He'd laugh, and the sound would crawl under my skin. He nicknamed me Coin Boy and Maxwell the Meek. It was his new favorite party trick, telling the story of the two keys, painting me as this pathetic, shuffling fool who got a piece of scrap metal while he, the chosen one, got the kingdom. The humiliation was a heavy cloak I couldn't seem to take off. It followed me everywhere. I started avoiding people, letting calls from our extended family go to voicemail. I knew what they were thinking. They'd always favored Nolan, and now my grandfather had given them official permission to write me off completely. I was a footnote in the Callahan story, the boring brother who got left behind. My nights were sleepless, filled with a churning mix of anger and sorrow. My mind kept replaying a loop of every slight, every moment of dismissal I'd ever endured. I remembered my 16th birthday. Nolan, who was 2 years older, had just gotten his license. Grandfather had a brand new metallic blue sports car delivered to the house for him, complete with a giant bow. Nolan had spent the day doing donuts on the lawn. For my birthday, I was given a set of antique woodworking tools. They were beautiful, made of dark cherry wood and polished steel, but in the shadow of Nolan's car, they looked like a joke. Nolan had laughed himself sick. "What are you gonna do with that, Max? Build yourself a personality." I ignored him. I spent the next 2 months in the old workshop, patiently restoring the tools, learning their balance, and then I used them to build a complex, inlaid chess set. The board was walnut and maple, and each piece was hand-carved. I presented it to my grandfather, my hands trembling slightly. He'd examined it for a moment, his face impassive. "Fine craftsmanship," he'd grunted, before setting it aside on a credenza, where it gathered dust for years. He never mentioned it again. The message was clear. My patient, meticulous work was fine, but it wasn't impressive. It wasn't power. Then my mind would drift to a more recent memory. A few years before he passed, we were in a board meeting for a subsidiary company. Nolan, eager to prove his mettle, presented a flashy proposal to acquire a volatile tech startup. It was all buzzwords and hockey stick projections, high risk, and in his mind, high reward. He was slick, confident, and the board was mesmerized. Then it was my turn. I had spent weeks developing a detailed plan to overhaul the company's logistics and supply chain. It was about incremental improvements, efficiency gains, and long-term stability. It was, in a word, boring. When I finished, the room was silent. Grandfather leaned back in his chair, a small, almost imperceptible smile on his lips as he looked at Nolan. "Your brother has guts," he said to me, but his eyes were on Nolan. "He understands that you have to break things to build an empire." Then he turned his gaze on me, and the smile vanished. "Your plan is safe. The world isn't built by safe men, Maxwell." He dismissed my work, my entire philosophy, in a single sentence. Nolan spent the rest of the day basking in the glow of his victory, while I quietly filed my proposal away, feeling like a fool. These memories churned in my gut, feeding the narrative that my grandfather had cemented with that tarnished coin. But in the midst of this despair, something else began to stir. It started with the coin itself. I kept it in my pocket, and I would take it out and turn it over and over in my fingers, the worn metal cool against my skin. The note was propped up on my desk. "The value of a thing is not what it is, but what it becomes. Patience is the currency of kings." At first, the words mocked me. Patience, my patience had earned me nothing but a lifetime of being overlooked. But as the weeks bled into a month, and then too, a different thought began to take root. What if it wasn't a punishment? What if it was a puzzle? My grandfather, for all his bluster, was not a simple man. He built his empire on complex strategies and an almost supernatural ability to see 10 moves ahead on the global chessboard. He didn't do things without a reason. Could this final act, as cruel as it seemed, have a deeper meaning? The thought was a tiny flicker of light in a vast darkness. I decided to focus on the only two things he'd given me, the coin and the note. The note was about patience. The coin was just a coin. Or was it? I started a new project. Instead of trying to parse the hurtful emotions, I channeled my energy into an investigation. I took the coin to a numismatist, a fussy little man named Dr. Albright, who peered at it through a jeweler's lupo. He cleaned a small section of it with a delicate touch. Interesting," he mumbled. "It's Roman, a denarius, probably from the reign of Vespasian. But this mark," he pointed to a tiny, almost invisible stamping near the edge. "This is not Roman, it's a countermark, a much later one. I've never seen this particular crest before." A crest. My heart skipped a beat. I had him send me a high-resolution photograph of the mark. For weeks I became a historian, a genealogist. I spent my days in libraries and my nights scrolling through digital archives, cross-referencing the strange little symbol, a hammer crossed with a quill pen, with old European guild markings and family coats of arms. Nolan was out there, burning through $1 million, becoming a caricature of new money. I was in a dusty library, chasing a ghost, and strangely, for the first time in months, I started to feel something other than hurt. I felt a sense of purpose. The breakthrough came at the 3-month mark. I found it, the crest. It was the original mark of the Callahan family, from before they were Callahans. Back in the 17th century, they were the O'Callahans of Cork, Ireland. They weren't titans of industry, they were stonemasons and scribes. The hammer for the craft, the quill for the contracts. They built things that lasted. They were patient, meticulous men. My grandfather's grandfather had immigrated to America and built the foundation of the family fortune, not with a risky gamble, but with a small, carefully managed construction business. Holding the coin, knowing its history, was like finding a key to a secret room in my own mind. My grandfather hadn't given me a worthless piece of metal. He had given me our history. He had given me a symbol of the family's true foundation, a foundation built on the very qualities he always seemed to despise in me: patience, craftsmanship, and quiet diligence. And that's when the catalyst occurred. It wasn't a sudden explosion, but a slow, quiet dawn. I was looking at a news article about Nolan's latest escapade. He'd apparently tried to race his Ferrari against a freight train and nearly got himself killed, and I didn't feel the familiar sting of shame or anger. I felt a profound, cold clarity. I looked at the coin in my hand, and then at the note on my desk. Patience is the currency of kings. It wasn't just a proverb, it was an instruction. The entire thing was a test. It had to be a test of character. My grandfather hadn't been punishing me. He'd been betting on me. He'd given Nolan a rope, and he was watching to see if he would climb it or hang himself with it. He'd given me an anchor, and he was watching to see if I would curse its weight or understand its purpose. My resolve solidified. It was no longer about hurt or getting my due. It was about honoring the staggering, terrifying, and brilliant faith my grandfather had placed in me at the very end. The 6-month mark for the will reading was approaching. Nolan was broke, his $1 million gone, leaving a trail of debt and bad press in its wake. I was still Coin Boy, the quiet fool, but I knew something he didn't. I knew the value of patience, and I was about to find out exactly what it could buy. The remaining 3 months were a study in contrast. Nolan's life became a public spectacle of decline. The $1 million, which had seemed like an infinite sum to him, evaporated with breathtaking speed. The tabloids that had once celebrated his lavish lifestyle now gleefully chronicled his fall. His penthouse was foreclosed on. The Ferrari was repossessed after he couldn't make the payments. The beautiful people who had flocked to his parties vanished like ghosts at sunrise, leaving him with nothing but massive credit card bills and a reputation as a reckless fool. He'd call me, not to gloat anymore, but in a sort of desperate, accusatory haze. The old man set me up. He'd slur over the phone late at night. He gave me that money, knowing I'd spend it. It was a trap. I would just listen, saying nothing. He was right, of course. It was a trap, but it was one he had walked into with his eyes wide open, whistling a jaunty tune. My life, on the other hand, remained quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet now. It wasn't the quiet of loneliness or shame. It was the quiet of focused preparation. My secret plan was deceptively simple: do nothing, follow the implicit instructions of my grandfather's test. But my internal state was a whirlwind of activity. The plan was endurance, but it was an active, conscious endurance. I focused on deciphering the full meaning of his final lesson. The value of a thing is not what it is, but what it becomes. He wasn't just talking about the coin or the money, he was talking about us, about Nolan and me. Nolan was given $1 million, and he had become a cautionary tale. I was given a tarnished coin, and I was becoming something else. I began to see my grandfather's foresight in everything. He had spent his life building an empire, and he knew better than anyone that an empire can be lost in a single generation by a fool. He needed an heir who understood preservation, not just acquisition. He needed a builder, not a gambler. All those years he'd spent praising Nolan's killer instinct, he must have been watching me, testing me in his own subtle ways. My boring logistics plan, my pointless hobby of woodworking, he hadn't dismissed them because they were worthless. He'd dismissed them publicly to see if I would abandon them, to see if my convictions were my own, or if they were dependent on his approval. By holding fast to who I was, I had been passing his tests for years without even knowing it. My main ally in this period was, in a strange way, Mr. Finch. I started scheduling monthly meetings with him under the guise of wanting to understand the family's corporate structure better. He was bound by his duties as executor not to reveal the will's contents, but his encouragement was a lifeline. He was a master of saying everything by saying nothing at all. I'd ask him about grandfather's investment philosophy, and he'd reply, "Your grandfather believed the best returns don't come from the swiftest transactions, but from the most patient positions." I'd bring up Nolan's public implosion, and Mr. Finch would just take a slow sip of his tea and say, "Character, Maxwell, is a form of collateral. When it is spent, it is very difficult to get back." He never broke his professional ethics, but in his dry, measured tones he was confirming my theory. He was telling me to hold the line. The subplot of the coin became my central focus. It was more than a hobby now, it was a communion with the ghost of my grandfather's original vision. I took a trip to Ireland, to Cork. I found the old parish records, the land deeds. I stood in the ruins of a stone cottage where the O'Callahans had lived. I could almost feel their presence, these patient men who worked with their hands, who built things to withstand the centuries. I learned that our ancestor, Declan O'Callahan, had carried that very denarius as a lucky piece. It was his connection to a history of empires rising and falling, a reminder that true strength was in endurance. The tarnish on the coin wasn't a flaw, it was a record. It was the patina of time, the proof of its survival. Standing there, in the green hills of Ireland, I finally understood. Nolan represented the shiny new disposable wealth that our family had become. The coin, and by extension me, represented the old enduring, foundational strength that had been forgotten. This realization was the true secret weapon reveal, and it happened entirely within me. I was no longer Maxwell the meek, the family disappointment. I was the keeper of the original flame. My quietness wasn't weakness, it was observation. My interest in history wasn't a pointless diversion, it was an understanding of our roots. I didn't need to defeat Nolan. He was defeating himself. I didn't need to win a race. I just needed to stand still with purpose and wait for the finish line to come to me. As I dug into the family's history, I also began a quiet, methodical study of the family's present. I used my knowledge of the corporate structure, gleaned from my meetings with Mr. Finch, to do a deep dive into Callahan Industries. I found the boring logistics plan I had proposed years ago and started updating it, running new models, refining it with modern data. It was still a solid plan, a profitable plan, a plan that would have added steady, sustainable value to the company, unlike the volatile tech startup Nolan had championed, which I discovered had gone bankrupt 2 years after he convinced grandfather to invest a small sum in it, a fact that was quietly swept under the rug. The contrast became my source of strength. Nolan was all noise, I was all signal. He was focused on the appearance of wealth, I was focused on the mechanics of it. He was playing checkers, making flashy jumps and crowing about his victories. I was playing a long, slow game of chess, understanding the value of every piece on the board. The 6 months were not a period of passive waiting, it was my education. It was my transformation. By the time the final summons from Mr. Finch arrived, I was no longer the boy who had walked out of the bank vault feeling hurt and confused. I was ready. The day of the will reading dawned gray and overcast, a perfect mirror of the mood that was about to descend on my family. The 6-month waiting period was over. I dressed carefully, not in a flashy suit like Nolan would, but in a simple, well-tailored dark gray suit. I felt a profound sense of calm, a stillness at my core that was unshakable. In my pocket, my fingers found the familiar worn surface of the Roman denarius. It was my touchstone, my link to the past and my key to the future. I was the first to arrive at the offices of Finch, Covington, and Crow. The large conference room was already prepared. A long, polished mahogany table reflected the dim light from the tall windows. Mr. Finch greeted me with a solemn nod. His eyes, usually so guarded, seemed to hold a flicker of something. Approval, perhaps. It was more validation than I'd received from my family in a decade. The rest of the family trickled in. Aunts, uncles, cousins. They were the sycophants, the courtiers of the Callahan dynasty. They offered me polite, slightly pitying smiles, and then immediately gravitated to the empty chair at the head of the table, the one they all assumed was reserved for Nolan. They saved their real enthusiasm for him, and then he arrived. Nolan made his entrance not with a bang, but with a whimper. He looked awful. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his face was pale and puffy, and there were dark circles under his eyes. The bravado was gone, replaced by a twitchy, nervous energy. He'd burned through the $1 million and had likely spent the last few weeks borrowing money just to keep up appearances. He gave me a weak, sneering look. Well, well, if it isn't Coin Boy, come to see how the real world works. I just looked at him, my expression neutral. Something like that, Nolan. He slumped into the chair at the head of the table, trying to project an aura of command he no longer possessed. The family members immediately swarmed him, offering praise for his business acumen and his bold vision, hollow words that rang false in the tense silence of the room. They were all betting on the horse they thought had already won. My first move in this silent takeover was simply to take my seat and wait. I chose a chair halfway down the table, an unassuming position. I was invisible to them, just a piece of the furniture, and that was exactly where I wanted to be. Mr. Finch cleared his throat, and the room fell silent. He began to read the will. The preliminary sections were standard fare, small bequests to long-serving staff, donations to my grandmother's favorite charities. I could feel Nolan's impatience growing. He tapped his fingers on the table, eager to get to the main event, the part where he was crowned king. Finally, Mr. Finch paused, took a sip of water, and adjusted his glasses. And now, he said, his voice dropping slightly, we come to the matter of the primary family trust and the controlling interest in Callahan Industries. A collective lean-in from everyone at the table. This was it. My grandfather had a unique perspective on wealth, Mr. Finch continued, looking around the room. He believed it was not just a prize to be won, but a responsibility to be earned. To that end, he inserted a special provision into the trust documents decades ago. He called it the Callahan Decoy Clause. A murmur went through the room. Decoy Clause. Nolan shot me a confused look, a flicker of unease in his eyes. Mr. Finch went on, his voice steady and methodical. 6 months ago, as per Jonathan's instructions, I provided both Nolan and Maxwell with a key to a safe deposit box. One box contained $1 million in bearer bonds, the other contained an item of symbolic rather than monetary value. This was not a bequest. It was a test. The air in the room became thick, heavy. I could see the dawning horror on Nolan's face. He was starting to understand. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. The blood was draining from his face, leaving his skin a pasty, sickly color. The decoy clause, Mr. Finch stated, his words landing like hammer blows, is a key man provision tied directly to the inheritance of the primary trust. The clause is explicit. The sole heir to the controlling interest of Callahan Industries and the entirety of the multi-billion-dollar family trust is the beneficiary who did not withdraw, access, or otherwise liquidate the funds or items from their designated seed box for a period of no less than 180 days. Silence. Absolute, ringing silence. Then Nolan's face, which had been a mask of confusion, crumpled. The panic hit him like a physical impact. It was a wave of pure, unadulterated terror. He pushed his chair back, the legs scraping loudly against the floor. "What?" he stammered, his voice a hoarse whisper. No, that's insane. That can't be real, Mr. Finch looked at him over the top of his spectacles, his expression as cold as a banker's heart. I assure you, Nolan, it is very real, and it is ironclad. Nolan's gaze shot to me. For the first time, he wasn't looking at me with pity or contempt. He was looking at me with raw, primal fear. He saw me, he truly saw me, and he didn't understand what he was seeing. The quiet brother, the fool, the sheep. How could this be happening? The panic began to boil over into rage. This is a joke. A sick joke by a senile old man, he yelled, his voice cracking. His eyes darted around the table, looking for support from the aunts and uncles who had been fawning over him moments before. But their faces were now masks of shock and rapid recalculation. They were looking at him like he was a bad investment, a stock that had just plummeted to zero. They didn't offer him support. They just stared, their allegiance evaporating before his very eyes. The silent takeover was complete. The crown had passed, and not a single shot had been fired. The immediate aftermath of Mr. Finch's revelation was like watching a building collapse in slow motion. The power structure of our family, which had been built around Nolan for my entire life, crumbled to dust in a matter of seconds. The shift was palpable, a physical change in the room's atmosphere. It began with the eyes. One by one, our aunts, uncles, and cousins turned their gazes away from the sputtering, panicked Nolan and towards me. Their expressions were a fascinating mixture of shock, confusion, and a dawning craven self-interest. This was the family exodus. It wasn't a stampede. It was a quiet, deliberate turning of the tide. Aunt Carol, who had always praised Nolan's dashing style, suddenly seemed to find the pattern on the carpet incredibly interesting. Uncle Richard, who had been loudly advising Nolan on tax shelters for his inevitable inheritance just 10 minutes prior, cleared his throat and subtly shifted his chair an inch away from him, a small but profound act of social distancing. They were rats deserting a sinking ship, and the speed of their departure was breathtaking. Nolan, however, was not going down without a fight. His panic had found an outlet, pure, unadulterated rage. He slammed his fist on the table, making the water glasses jump. "This is garbage. I won't accept this." He gave me those bonds. They were a gift. They were a test. "Nolan," Mr. Finch said calmly, his voice cutting through Nolan's tirade. "A test you failed. He cheated." Nolan screamed, pointing a trembling finger at me. "He must have known. You told him, didn't you, Finch? You were always jealous of my relationship with the old man. You conspired with him." I remained silent, watching him. This was the final damning piece of evidence. He was proving to everyone in the room exactly why he was unfit to lead. He was incapable of taking responsibility, of seeing his own flaws. It was always someone else's fault. "I will sue," he snarled, his face turning a blotchy red. "I will break this will. I'll tell every newspaper in the country that my grandfather was senile, that he was manipulated by a crooked lawyer and his pathetic, spineless son. I will burn this family's name to the ground before I let him have it." He was spiraling, his threats becoming more and more unhinged. He tried to lunge across the table, not at me, but at the will itself, as if tearing the paper could undo the reality it represented. Uncle Richard, who was closest, instinctively put a hand on his arm to restrain him. Nolan shoved him away violently. "Get off of me." The room was in chaos. The family members who had been trying to subtly distance themselves were now openly recoiling from him. He was a wild animal, cornered and lashing out. His polished charisma had been stripped away, revealing the raw, ugly greed and entitlement that lay beneath. It was a complete and total public meltdown, a self-immolation fueled by a lifetime of getting everything he ever wanted. He was finally facing a consequence he couldn't buy, charm, or bully his way out of, and it was destroying him. I waited until his screaming devolved into ragged, gasping breaths. He stood there, chest heaving, his wild eyes daring anyone to challenge him. The room was deathly quiet, the only sound his frantic breathing. This was my moment. This was the confrontation I had been unknowingly preparing for my entire life. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I let the silence stretch, letting his desperation hang in the air for everyone to witness. Then I spoke. My voice was low, calm, and carried across the room with absolute clarity. "He didn't give you $1 million, Nolan." Every head turned to me. Nolan stared, his mouth agape. "He gave you a choice," I continued, my eyes locked on his. "He gave you the freedom to be exactly who you are. And you chose this. All of this." I gestured vaguely at his disheveled appearance, his panicked state. I reached into my pocket and slowly pulled out the tarnished silver denarius. I placed it gently on the polished table. It seemed to absorb the light in the room, a small dark anchor in a sea of mahogany. "He gave me a choice too," I said softly. "He gave me this, a reminder of what this family was built on. Not fast money, not flash, and not a killer instinct that tears everything down." I picked the coin up and held it between my thumb and forefinger. It was built on this: patience, craftsmanship, endurance. Things you saw as weaknesses, things you mocked me for, but they are the foundation, Nolan. You spent your life dancing on the roof, and you never once thought to check if the foundation was sound. Nolan just stared at the coin, then at me, his face a canvas of disbelief. He had no response. My words weren't an attack, they were a diagnosis. and it was terminal. Mr. Finch chose that moment to deliver the final clinical blow. He slid a thin folder across the table. "For the record," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion, "here are the transaction logs from the National Commerce Bank. This document, signed by you, Nolan, confirms the liquidation of the bearer bonds on April 12th at 2:15 p.m. He slid another paper forward, "and this is the access log for box 714. It shows one entry, on April 12th. It has remained untouched since." He leaned back in his chair. "The clause, as I said, is ironclad. Your grandfather had it vetted by 3 separate legal teams over the years. Any legal challenge would be dismissed out of hand. Furthermore, pursuing such a challenge would subject your recent financial activities to legal discovery. Given your expenditures over the past 6 months, I imagine that is a level of scrutiny you would prefer to avoid." That was it. The checkmate. The threat of legal discovery, of having his debts and his recklessness laid bare for the world to see, was the final nail in his coffin. The fight went out of him completely. The rage evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, defeated shell. He looked around the room one last time, at the faces of his family, who now refused to meet his gaze. There was no support here, no allies, no escape. He was utterly, completely alone. Without another word, Nolan turned and walked out of the room. He didn't slam the door, he didn't make a sound, he just left. The door swung silently shut behind him, and with it an entire era of my life came to an end. The new reality had begun. The silence that followed Nolan's exit was profound. It was the sound of a dynasty shifting on its axis. I looked down at the coin in my hand, then at the faces around the table. They were looking at me now, not as Maxwell the Meek, but as Maxwell Callahan, the head of the family. The richest man in the family. The power was mine, but the victory didn't feel like a fiery explosion of triumph. It felt like a deep, quiet, and immensely satisfying settling. It felt like justice. In the days and weeks that followed, the new reality set in. My first act as the head of the Callahan Trust was not to go on a spending spree but to go to work. I unearthed my old boring logistics plan. I convened the board of Callahan Industries, the same board that had watched my grandfather dismiss my ideas years ago. This time they listened. They listened as I laid out a vision for the company not based on high-risk gambles, but on sustainable growth, on strengthening our foundation, on investing in our people and our infrastructure. It was a vision of patience, of building something that would last for another 100 years. There were some old guard members, loyalists to Nolan's flashy style, who were skeptical. I didn't fire them. I gave them the data, showed them the models, and gave them a choice: get on board with the new vision, or step aside. Within a year, the logistics overhaul had increased our profit margins by 18%, and the company's stock price was at an all-time high. I didn't break things to build an empire, I fixed them. I used the family's immense resources to create 2 new foundations. The first was the Callahan Guild, a foundation that provided grants and apprenticeships for young people in traditional crafts, woodworking, masonry, metalworking, the very skills our family was built on. The second was the O'Callahan Historical Preservation Trust, dedicated to restoring historical sites and archives, ensuring that the stories of the past, the lessons of endurance, were not forgotten. It was my way of honoring the coin, of paying forward the lesson my grandfather had taught me. As for Nolan, his fall was as swift as it was brutal. His debts were astronomical. The friends who had surrounded him at his lavish parties wanted nothing to do with him now that the money was gone. He was forced to declare bankruptcy. The penthouse, the last vestiges of his designer wardrobe, everything was sold off to pay his creditors. I heard through the family grapevine that he ended up in a small rented apartment on the outskirts of the city, working a low-level sales job. We never spoke again. There was nothing left to say. My grandfather hadn't just disinherited him. He had engineered a situation where Nolan's own character would be the instrument of his downfall. It was a complete and total karmic payoff, as precise and devastating as a surgeon's cut. Sometimes, late at night in my grandfather's old study, which I now used as my own, I take out the tarnished silver coin. I turn it over in my hand, feeling the weight of it, the history. It sits on my desk, right next to that hand-carved chess set I made when I was a boy. They are my reminders. My grandfather's greatest gift wasn't the billions of dollars in the trust. It was the final difficult lesson he taught me. He saw a strength in me that I, and everyone else, had mistaken for weakness. He didn't want an heir who was a shark. A shark just consumes. He wanted a gardener, someone who understood that true, lasting wealth isn't hunted, it's cultivated, it's grown, slowly, patiently, with care and with an eye towards the future. He spent my entire life making me feel like an outsider, all to prepare me for the one moment where being an outsider was the only way to win. It was the longest, most complex, and most brilliant strategic play of his entire life. So here's what I want you to take away from my story. The world will try to tell you who you are. It will label you, categorize you, and put you in a box. It will praise the loud over the quiet, the fast over the steady, the flashy over the solid. But the true measure of your worth isn't found in the opinion of others. It's found in your own character, in your own convictions. Patience isn't passive, it's a form of strength. It's the currency of kings. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Thank you for listening to my story. It's been a wild ride, and finally being able to tell it all feels like closing the last chapter of a very long book. I'm curious, what would you have done if you were in my shoes? Would you have held on to the coin? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story and want to hear more like it, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps, and it lets me know you want to see more content like this. Thanks again for being here.